Last time I worked on the Yamaha, I was going to drain the oil out and see what condition the oil was in, and when I got underneath there to drain it out, much to my surprise, I found that the oil plug was completely missing. The crankcase was empty. Whoever was tinkering with this thing before I got it to see whether or not it could be repaired apparently had pulled that out, and all those parts were missing. I went online and checked prices on various parts, and what was missing was the oil plug itself, the O-ring, this little screen, this spring, and this little nipple-like thing here that was actually labeled as an oil pipe in the parts list. And when you take this plug off, the spring basically is going to come out with this. Why this was missing, I don't know, but it may have fallen out when they had it apart. So I found a guy on eBay. He was parting out a Yamaha Bearcat 350, I think, and I happened to check and notice that the part numbers on the parts breakdown were the same. So they both used the same screen and spring and plug. So he sold me the plug and the screen and the spring, and I actually paid him a couple bucks extra, and I asked him if he would throw in this nipple, which he did. He told me that he had a really hard time getting this out. He had to break the case in half, split the case to get it out, which I see why now. It looks to me like he had to grip onto this with some pliers or something and wrench it out of there. He really did a number on it, but I don't think that's going to be critical to the operation of this, as long as I can get it into the hole that it's supposed to go into in the bottom of the oil pump. Not even quite sure what the purpose of this really is. I imagine it kind of sits down inside here, and well, anyways, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to install these parts, see if this is going to fit, and then install these other parts today, and then I'll be able to start reassembling my top end. Alright, parts from the Bearcat 350 were a perfect fit. So that little pipe just sticks up into the hole in the bottom of the oil pump, and then you place the little cup screen on top of the spring and put that whole assembly on top of your cap, and then raise the whole assembly with the O-ring into position, and then put the socket on it and push up as you turn gently to just kind of get it to thread. And once it starts threading, then you can put a ratchet on it and snug it up. The O-ring that was on there was still in pretty decent shape. I'm just going to go with that O-ring for now, because if I get this running and actually see some hopes of this being a fruitful project, then shortly after I get it running, I'm going to drain the crankcase again and refill again, only because I still have fears of some contamination in there, water contamination or whatnot that might still be in there. So I'm not going to run it very long with the oil I'm going to put in it after I put the top end together. And I'm also going to change out the filter, and I bought more than one filter, so I'm all set there. Okay, first step I'm going to do is I'm going to take my cleaned up piston, and I'm going to install the new piston rings. Now, I didn't overbore this cylinder because as far as wear limits go, it had very little wear on it. The only concern on the cylinder was the light pitting from corrosion, and that was at the very top where the water had been sitting on top of the piston, between the top ring and the top of the piston, in that gap there. So our feeling at that point was the machinist I had work on it honed it for me, and he said, well, worst case scenario is it's going to smoke, and if it smokes, then I know at some point I'll have to get it bored over and get a new piston and rings overboard size. But I didn't want to sink that much money into it until I know whether or not everything else on this thing is salvageable. So what we're going to do is we're going to put just a new set of rings in, which these rings were dirt cheap. I found these on eBay, probably new old stock, judging from the price on them. Cheap, genuine Yamaha piston rings. So I'm going to install the rings on the piston. Alright, just a note, when you're installing this oil control ring, which is a 3-piece assembly, it's got 2 very thin rings, and then this is sandwiched between them. You don't want to put one of these on first and then try and get this in, because on this middle assembly there's actually tiny ridges, and they actually are supposed to be behind this ring here. So if you put this ring on first, you're not going to be able to get this in correctly. So what you want to do is you want to install this first, and then this, and of course this goes in the widest groove. Before the piston rings, the new piston rings can be installed, you need to do a couple of things. One of the things that needs to be done is you need to check the end gap on the piston ring. And the end gap is basically when the piston ring is in the cylinder, it's this gap where the 2 ends of the ring end. And the reason why you need to check the end gap is because if the end gap is too small, what can happen is as the rings heat up and the motor's running, they can actually start to push against each other and cause the ring to hang up, and that can actually cause a number of problems and could scuff the cylinder wall and cause some damage. So that's why it's important to check the end gap. So you've got to check the end gap for the 2 compression rings, which are the 2 topmost rings on the piston. So I've inserted one of the rings, and what you want to do is you want to check the end gap at the top of the cylinder and the bottom of the cylinder, because when the cylinder wears, it tends to wear unevenly. You tend to have a wider dimension at the top here than you do at the bottom, so you want to check it in both places. So you've got to insert the ring into the cylinder, and then what you want to do is, I'm using just a depth gauge off of my calipers, and I use that and I just ride that around the top, and I push up with my finger underneath to make sure that I've basically got the ring all the way around. It's at the same depth, so that way I know the ring's not cocked in the cylinder either way. So that's going to give me an accurate measurement. Once I've done that, I then take my feeler gauges and I actually check the gap right here. So I'm going to do that now. Okay, I just measured the ring end gap. 19 thousandths was a go, 20 thousandths was a no-go, so 19 thousandths is my number. And then I measure the bore to see how many inches it is, and the bore is 3.75 inches. So you multiply 3.75 by 0.004, and that's your minimum number. So let's see. Alright, had to whip out the old calculator on the phone, but 3.75 times 4 thousandths is 15 thousandths. So minimum end gap needs to be 15 thousandths, and right now I'm getting 19 thousandths. So my end gap is good at this position. So now I'm going to just repeat the process from the top side of the cylinder. Okay, now I've turned the cylinder over, the top facing up. Again, I've used my depth gauge on the caliper to make sure the ring is parallel distance from the top surface of the cylinder. And I'm going to check my end gap. Okay, and actually it's moved a little bit, but it looks like 19 thousandths is a no-go. So the end gap is actually smaller on the top here, and that's interesting because if I let's see, for the end gap to be smaller, it means that the ring must be compressed a little more this way. which would indicate that the bore at the top here is actually a little bit smaller, the opposite of what I would have expected for a wear pattern. Okay, the end gap here, I just checked it, and it's a little tight, but the 17 thousandths gauge does go in, so it's probably about just a hair under 17 thousandths, which is over the minimum of 15 thousandths, so we're good to go. Now I'm going to repeat this entire process for the other compression ring. Okay, here's the other compression ring. Now on this compression ring, 15 thousandths is the size of the end gap, which is the minimum. So lucked out there. Not going to bother checking it from the other side because I know from the last measurement that the bore is tighter at the top here than it is at the bottom. So if it passes here, it's definitely going to pass at the bottom. Okay, now I can install the rings on the piston. The oil control ring, the lowest ring, it's pretty easy. Pretty much I just went over this in the video before when I had all the rings on there. I then took the rings off because I realized that I wanted to check the end gap on the rings, and also I wanted to verify the correct order of the rings. Now I have the service manual, but the service manual, when it talks about installing the rings, it doesn't differentiate which ring is which. I think probably when the manual was written, the replacement rings were maybe just regular iron rings, or maybe they just figure that you would rely on the information that usually comes with the replacement rings. The reason why I say all this is because this ring has a chrome layer on it by the looks of it, and you can actually see it at an angle much better, and this is a regular iron ring. So oftentimes you want to refer to the paperwork that comes with the rings. This is how these genuine Yamaha rings came packaged. There's no paperwork in it, and there's nothing to indicate which way to install the rings. However, all of the rings that I've seen out there that have one chrome ring or coated ring is almost always going to be the top compression ring. And so we're going to put the chrome ring in the top groove, and we're going to put the regular iron ring in the next groove. Then the next thing that's common to most rings is the fact that if the rings have a bevel, which if you look at the cross section of this ring, it's completely rectangular. So there's no bevel on this ring. If it were to have a bevel, generally speaking, on most installations, the bevel faces up. That being said, if the ring has no markings and no bevel, typically it can go either way. If the ring has any markings on it, typically the markings face up. This ring, the only markings I can find is a small tiny R. So we're going to put this ring in the second groove down with the R facing up. The chrome ring has no markings whatsoever on either side. It also has no bevel, which would indicate that it could probably go either way just perfectly. So we're going to put it into the top groove. Alright, I've got the rings installed. Now the last thing I want to do before I finish with the piston assembly is I want to orient the rings. And what I mean by that is you've got the end gap there on all of the rings, and you want to make sure that they're in proper position. So the service manual actually gives you a guide. Oftentimes you can go on to many of the manufacturer websites if you're using aftermarket rings, and they'll often tell you exactly how to orient the rings, or the paperwork that might come with the rings might also talk about how to orient the rings. But basically we've got a little diagram right here, and it shows you looking down from the top of the piston. We've got the arrow facing forward, which we've got that arrow right there, and they're telling you that A, which is the top ring end, is pretty much at 12 o'clock. B, the oil ring end for the lower oil control ring, is going to be at about 4 o'clock. C, which is the oil ring upper, is going to be at about a little past 3 o'clock. And then D, which is your second ring, your second compression ring, is going to be at about 8 o'clock. So I'm going to orient those now. I've got my rings oriented. Now the next step for reassembly, according to the service manual, is to actually put the piston on the top of the connecting rod, put your wrist pin in, put your retaining clip in, and then you're supposed to, while lowering the cylinder into position, compress the rings with your fingers from the underside and insert the piston into the bottom, and then lower the whole assembly down onto the top of the crankcase. Now, I'm not saying that's not possible. I mean, I'm sure people do it all the time maybe, but the reality is, working alone without an extra pair of hands, not doing this all the time, I think that's going to be kind of tricky. So I want to try something a little different. My idea is going to be to flip the cylinder over, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my piston ring compressor, and I'm going to compress the rings, and I'm going to insert the piston upside down into the upside down cylinder jug, and then slide my ring compression tool out so that the piston is now stuck into the bottom of the jug, but still sticking out enough to expose the hole that the wrist pin goes into. And then I'm going to try and invert the whole assembly and insert the wrist pin once the connecting rod's in place, and see if I can't make that work. There is a beveled edge on the bottom of the cylinder here that I'm sure that's there to ease in the installation of the piston rings if you're doing it with your hands. So you could probably do what I just did if you want to try this method with your hands compressing the rings. But I've got a piston ring compressor that I've bought for other projects, and it works perfectly fine, so I decided to use that. The way this works is this sleeve doesn't actually go down the cylinder. What it does is it sits, you put it around the piston and compress the rings down, and then you just kind of sit it on top, and then you gently, you pre-lubricate this. Also, this is a good time to mention that I pre-lubricated the cylinder walls and the piston rings and the piston assembly with clean engine oil, which is what's prescribed in the service manual. And anyways, then once you have that sitting on top there with the compressor around it, you gently tap with a wooden mallet, or I use the butt end of this handle on my ball peen, gently tap it down, and it'll pop into the cylinder. And so it's in now. I also made sure that the arrow on top of the piston is pointing towards what would be the front of the motor, or the exhaust side of the engine, which is this way. So right now I've got it in. I actually popped it in a little too far. I've got to back it back out. I want to back it back out so that I'll be able to get my wrist pin in place. Alright, so now here's where I want it. I've got enough clearance now that I'll be able to slide the wrist pin into place, but the rings are still inserted far enough that they're staying in proper position. Okay, I've now removed the old cylinder base gasket. I've installed the new base gasket. I've put a light coat of RTV sealant on the base gasket. I'm going to make sure I put some oil on the top of the connecting rod journal, and then I'm going to get ready to install that whole assembly. And then you got to lower it down. You're going to make sure you don't damage this guide for the timing chain. And then also I'm going to pass my little wire here through. That's going to help me fish the timing chain back up through the cylinder and make sure it doesn't fall back down into the crankcase. So you get a lot going on here in a short amount of time. And then also it's a good idea to stuff a rag down inside here around the base of the connecting rod as you're installing the wrist pin clip, because if the clip falls down inside the crankcase, you're going to have a real headache. Alright, so now I have the whole assembly put together, and I've got it tilted over,
and this works out great, so that kind of holds it in place for me while I snap the ring in. I've got the ring snapped in, I lubed everything up with oil, and now I'm going to just put a liberal coat of oil on the part of the piston skirt that's still exposed, and I'm going to make sure this guide goes into here as I turn it, and I'm going to lower it into position. Now it's installed, and now I can start installing the nuts and bolts. Okay, now I'm going to torque down the nuts that hold down this base. They're almost like a cap nut. And the specs for that is the nuts are supposed to be 30 foot-pounds, and the bolts, 6mm bolts, which are these two little ones here, are 7.2 foot-pounds.